Hello, welcome back to History 475. I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video lecture number 9. All right, we've been talking quite a bit about Madison, especially his younger years, uh, and I hope that you have some grasp of how Madison becomes the political philosopher that he becomes. But we can't stay on his early years forever. So let's skip forward, please, to his presidency. Now, of course, we know that Madison follows Thomas Jefferson as president of the United States. And one of the most important issues of Jefferson's presidency was the Jeffersonian Embargo. And we said that you can take two approaches to the Jefferson embargo. You can say it was a failure, and you can justify that by saying the people were very much against it because the people were not willing to make the financial sacrifices that were necessary for the embargo to succeed. But you can also make a strong argument that it, in fact, succeeded because what was not known at the time that the embargo was canceled was that the British government was caving in, that the British government was willing to stop doing those things to the Americans that had caused the Americans to create the embargo to begin with. Well, nevertheless, the embargo expires on the day that Madison took office as the fourth president of the United States, which you don't have to remember this, but it was March 4th, 1809. All right. The embargo had already been replaced in February of that same year by another piece of legislation called the Non-Intercourse Act. And for our purposes, let's just simply say that it was so much like the Jefferson embargo that the differences between the two pieces of legislation were trivial. Neither one of them worked. Now, by the time of the inauguration, Madison's health had suffered due to the demands of his position as Jefferson's Secretary of State. Fortunately, there was a bright spot in his life and that was his marriage to Dolly Madison. He was an old bachelor by now. No one ever expected James Madison to ever marry, and then he meets Dolly. They marry, and immediately after moving into the White House, after he's elected in the election of 1808, she began to make it suitable for entertaining. It soon became the White House not because of James Madison, but because of Dolly Madison. The White House soon became the focal point for Washington society. Dolly was a socialite. She loved people. She loved to entertain. She loved parties. My mother would have referred to her as a social butterfly, flitting from one flower to the next flower, flitting from one party to the next party. Now, that is to not make light of the importance that Dolly Madison had to her husband, James. Now, Jefferson had used the White House for small, intimate dinners where he wined and dined and entertained while amazing his guests with his brilliance and his knowledge on a really wide range of subjects. And all of that is true. Jefferson was a brilliant man. He knew a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. The Madisons entertained in a more traditional way, with a more informal style that was warm and unpretentious, which was sort of Dolly's style too. Now, Politically, James Madison did not enjoy the personal loyalty and affection that Jefferson had earned and enjoyed during his 2 terms in office. The Federalist Party, while not strong anymore, still existed, and they had actually made a little comeback, a modest revival, if you will, based on their opposition to the Jefferson Embargo. The Federalists were strong in New England by this time. That's about the only place that they were strong, was in New England. And of course, New England was the manufacturing center of the United States. Let me stop right there and tell you that we were not yet a strong manufacturing, a strong industrial country. We were still taking baby steps. Now, in the future, we would become the world's strongest industrial economy, wouldn't we? But not yet. It's early 1809. We're still taking those baby steps. But what industry we have, and it's still not much, but what we have is pretty much located in New England. And that's where the Federalists were the strongest. And they were stronger, they were strongest in New England because it was New England that had been hurt the most by the Jefferson Embargo. So it sort of makes sense that the Federalists of New England would oppose the embargo. The Federalists by this time, though, had weakened so much, especially nationwide, that they no longer really posed a political threat to the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson and now Madison. At the very worst, they were a nuisance. They were troublemakers in Congress, but they were not much more than just troublemakers. Had they been stronger, we play what if history if we want to. Had they been stronger, they might have forced the Republicans to rally more closely around Madison, but that didn't happen. Now, one of the critical tasks facing Madison when he becomes the president is to sort out all the diplomatic options that were available to him in the aftermath of the Jefferson Embargo. There were indications, for example, based on statements made by the British ambassador, a man by the name of David Erskine, Erskine, that the British might revoke their opposition to America's neutral trade rights if the U.S. would not apply the Non-Intercourse Act to Britain. Right? Leave us out of it, and we will support you. In fact, Madison publicly announced that such an agreement had been reached. However, it was soon made known that Erskine had overstepped his bounds and had defied his instructions from the British government on several key points. And as a result, the British government sort of slapped Erskine's wrist and repudiated this imaginary agreement that Erskine had announced that really did not exist. When word reached Madison that Erskine's behavior had led to an agreement disapproved of by the British government, he immediately reinstated the terms of the Non-Intercourse Act to make sure that England was included in the Non-Intercourse Act. Meanwhile, here's the problem. Meanwhile, hundreds of United States ships had put to sea bound for ports in England and in the British West Indies, places like Jamaica and Barbados, because they were confident that they were safe from being stopped by the British, not knowing, once they got to sea, they were literally cut off from all communication, not knowing that this agreement that they thought was in place had never been in place. And so the British Navy continued to stop American ships on the high seas, take crew members off the ship that they suspected of being British deserters, confiscating cargoes, and sometimes even confiscating ships. Additionally, both the British and the French blockades against each other. So no matter where an American ship might go, they were really at risk of being stopped by, if the ship went to France, the American ship was in danger of being stopped by a British ship. If they went to England, the American ship was in danger of being stopped by a French ship. The whole idea of neutrality, which sounds so great on paper, was a non-starter. It didn't work. It never worked. And neutrality, even today, sounds great on paper, right? We're going to treat everybody equally, right? We're not going to play favorites. All we ask that we be able to take our stuff all over the world. Well, it didn't work then, and it doesn't work now. Now, alternatives were unattractive. If the United States continued to take a strong position on neutral trading rights, in other words, we have the right to trade no matter where we want to, then it would find itself in conflict with both England and with France. And the United States certainly could not risk war with either of those powers. Most certainly, they couldn't go to war with them at the same time, both of them at the same time. Plus, the Congress was reluctant to rebuild the military that had been so weakened by Jefferson's cost cutting and anti-military policies. Remember when uh, Jefferson slashed the size of the army, he slashed the size of the Navy in order to save money, and it did save money. But by the year 1809, as we say here in the South, the chickens had come home to roost. And our military was so weak that we couldn't fight our way out of a wet paper bag. Now, Jefferson is safely retired back in Monticello. He's out of the picture, and he has left all these problems to his friend, truly his friend, James Madison. Madison decides to, now he doesn't want to go to war with France. He doesn't want to go to war with England. But he wants to keep trading with both. Madison decided to stick with a combination of two things: economic coercion and diplomacy. But his inability to control his own party, remember, he is the president, is by this time is the leader of his own party. Madison was a Democratic Republican. As a matter of fact, he had helped Jefferson create the party. But he was unable to control his own party. Additionally, Madison's political beliefs hindered him. Remember, Madison was believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. Fundamentally, if something didn't appear in the Constitution, then you couldn't do it. Now, what does the Constitution say about foreign policy? Well, what it says is that diplomats, for example, will negotiate and create treaties, but in order for that treaty to go into effect, it must be approved of by the United States Senate. And that's exactly what it said. And as a result, Madison did not involve himself too much with foreign policy because he would nominate the diplomats, but after that he pretty much stayed out of the way because He said the diplomats have a job, and so does the Senate. And nowhere in that is the president supposed to be involved. He did not believe that the executive alone, the president alone, should create foreign policy, especially foreign economic policy. And isn't that exactly what we're talking about here? Foreign economic policy? Because the House of Representatives in Article 1 is given the power of the purse. It's the House of Representatives who introduces, for example, tax legislation into the Congress. Now, Madison had strong principles, and we are obligated to appreciate that. It was admirable that he had these principles and that he was willing to stick with them. But those same principles damaged him at home politically and undermined his diplomatic strategies overseas. Okay. Now, let's start talking about the run up to the War of 1812 and the War of 1812 itself. Now, a number of things that we're going to talk about, what I just said was that we're going to talk about the run up to the war and the war itself. But some of the things that we're going to talk about seemingly have no relationship to the war. But hopefully, I'll be able to to convince you that this is something that some of these things are related to the War of 1812. Now, the Bank of the United States that had been suggested by Alexander Hamilton almost 20 years earlier and had been approved and had been created and approved by the Congress had been opposed by both Jefferson and Madison. As a matter of fact, it is correct to say that the disagreement between Hamilton on the one hand and Jefferson and Madison on the other hand led to the creation of the first political parties in the United States. Hamilton with the Federalists, Jefferson and Madison with the Democratic Republicans. Now, Jefferson and Madison opposed the creation of the Bank of the United States, which was modeled by Hamilton on the Bank of England. They did not necessarily base their opposition to the creation of the bank. They thought the bank was a great idea. They were convinced that the bank would do exactly what Hamilton said it would do. No, it's not that they didn't base their opinion on any of that. They based their opposition to the bank on the simple fact that the Constitution did not mention the creation of any type of a bank like that. And so, it in their minds, it was unconstitutional. However, uh, Washington was the president when all this was taking place, and Washington was a Federalist. Now, he wasn't as strict a Federalist as a Hamilton, but nevertheless, he was a Federalist. And the result is that because of Washington's influence, the Congress passed the legislation that created the Bank of the United States. Now, remember, one of the features of the Bank of the United States is that its charter, which was given by the Congress, its charter would only last for 20 years. At the end of that 20-year period, the Congress would then make a decision over whether or not to recharter the Bank of the United States for another 20 years. Well, the bank had been created in 1791. 20 years later, it was 1811. In 1791, the Federalist Washington had been the president. In the year 1811, the Democratic Republican Madison was the president. And he had majorities in the Congress. And so in the year 1811, when the recharter of the Bank of the United States came up, it failed. For all practical intents and purposes, the Bank of the United States died, at least temporarily. Now, in hindsight, we know that it's going to be resurrected, but not yet. It's 1811, and one of the most valuable institutions that the valuable financial institutions that the United States has, the Bank of the United States, no longer exists. Now, while all of that is taking place, our relationship with England continues to deteriorate. They keep stopping our ships. They keep taking crews off our ships. They keep confiscating cargoes, and occasionally they confiscate entire ships as well. Now, Congress saw that that there was a possibility that we were drifting toward war with England. And Congress wanted to expand the army to 25,000 to a size of 25,000. 25,000 soldiers serving 5-year terms of enlistment. Madison felt that doing so was more than the country could raise or afford. The expanded expense of the Congress's proposed army left little money to finance the expansion of the Navy. Of course, everyone knew that if we went to war with England again, that it was going to be necessary to oppose the British Navy, which was the strongest, the biggest, the best equipped Navy in the whole world, that we were going to have to somehow face them. And our Navy just about didn't exist by this time. Now, Madison, however, please remember that Madison is a strict constructionist. And as a matter of fact, he was instrumental in writing the Constitution. If anybody knows the content of the Constitution, it's James Madison. Madison also knew that the Congress has the power of the purse. And so, once again, Madison did not interfere with the congressional plans to enlarge the army, even though they were in direct opposition to his thoughts. But finally, Congress began to drop hints that they really wanted to work more closely with the president, that they really wanted presidential guidance in this matter. And so, on March 31st, 1812, Madison's Secretary of State, who was James Monroe, future President of the United States, told the House Committee on Foreign Affairs that Madison believed that, this is a quote, without accommodation by Great Britain, Congress ought to declare war before adjourning. In other words, unless the British back off. That's what that accommodation word means, right? So unless the British change their tune, unless they back off, unless they cut us some slack, use whatever little analogy you want to, that unless that happens, that we needed to go to war with England, and we needed to go to war pretty soon. But he said, no action about a declaration of war should be taken before the ship Hornet, an American ship named Hornet, returned from Europe with the latest diplomatic messages from the British in London. We knew that the Hornet had left England. We knew that it was somewhere out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, heading for Washington. And Madison said, "Let's take a little time out here, and let's wait for the Hornet to get home and see what those messages from the American diplomats in London. Let's see what they say." When the ship arrived in May, as it turns out, very little had changed. Napoleon's position on U.S. shipping was unchanged, right? He was still trying to stop American stuff because he thought that every time an American ship went to England, it was helping England and hurting France in these Napoleonic wars that were still going on. Now, there was some dissension within England. The British government had one opinion about all of this, but the English people seemed to have a totally different opinion. The British government was insisted on sticking with its guns. It insisted on forcing the United States to stop doing the things that were prompting England to put in the blockades and stop the shipping on the high seas. The British people, though, and especially the British merchants, were beginning to hurt because England depended so much on American goods, especially American cotton. Um, Nothing had changed, really, with regard to America's relationship to England or France. Madison felt that that a war with Britain by itself would would help the Federalist Party. So there are political considerations that are being factored into this formula. And also, he was afraid it would make the Federalists stronger. And he was also afraid that some of the Republicans of his own party might take up the side of the Federalists, might cross what we today would say cross party lines and vote with the Federalists. However, late in May of 1810, of 1811, a group of Republican congressmen led by Henry Clay. Now, there's a famous name in American history. At that time, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. They visited Madison in the White House and they demanded action on the part of Madison. And Madison complied. On June 1st, he requested a declaration of war. And the reasons that he gave for a declaration of war with England were the actions of the British that included the impressments, the taking of American sailors off American vessels, violations of neutrality. In other words, we had claimed that we were going to be neutral in all these wars over in Europe, and yet the English were still picking on us. He asked that a similar decision against France be postponed while diplomatic talks continued in Paris. So this is targeted at the British alone. The House of Representatives approved the declaration on June the 4th, 1812, and the Senate approved it on June 17th. It was nowhere near unanimous. You don't have to remember these numbers. I'm just giving them to you to prove that there was a lot of disagreement. The declaration of war was approved in the House by a 79 to 40 vote, about a 2-to-1 margin, and it was approved in the Senate by a 19 to 13 margin, which is what is that? About the same margin. Madison signed the declaration on June 18th, 1812. 5 days later, now, once again, the idea that the fastest communication was limited by the fastest transportation. Okay. 5 days later, unaware that the United States had declared war on them, the British pretty much gave up on the blockade and all of those things that they had been doing. They promised to stopping the American ships on the high seas. They promised to stop doing all of that stuff. The problem is that nobody knew when they did that, which is exactly what the United States wanted all along. Yes, so the United States wins the diplomatic argument, but the British don't know that 5 days earlier that the Americans had declared war on them. Had the British acted several months earlier, a war very well might have been prevented. But by now, by June of 1812, most Americans and most government officials were relieved to have made the decision to go to war. A war that many Americans would eventually begin to consider as a second war of independence. Now, let's talk about the Federalists. Remember, the Federalists are a dying party. They're on their last legs. The Federalists and some dissident Republicans had been hopeful that Madison would not be renominated for a second term. Remember, he's elected in 1808. So in 1812, he will stand for re-election again. And the Federalists and some of his fellow Republicans hope that nobody will vote for him. I'm sorry, no, that's not correct. They are hoping that he will not be renominated and will not be permitted to run for a second term. He, however, was renominated by the majority of the Republicans in the Congress, although a lot of the Republicans in the Congress just refused to vote. They just sat on their hands, and they didn't vote yes, and they didn't vote no. But of those who voted, it was unanimous. It was an 82-0 vote for him being renominated. Now, the Federalists run a candidate in the election of 1812. The governor of New York State, a man by the name of George Clinton, DeWitt Clinton, DeWitt, DeWitt Clinton, ran as the Federalist candidate for the presidency. And Clinton carried the state of New York, his home state, and of course that shouldn't surprise us at all. But he also carried all of New England except for Vermont. And that shouldn't surprise us either, because New England was the stronghold, as I said earlier. New England was the stronghold for the remnants of the Federalist Party. Madison didn't even campaign. Madison knew how weak the Federalists were. And so his philosophy was, why waste your time campaigning in a campaign that you're guaranteed to win anyway. And he was right. He won re-election, and he won that re-election by a substantial margin. Now, once again, you don't have to remember these numbers, but I want you to know that Madison cleaned Clinton's clock. Okay, the electoral vote was 128 to 29. 128 to 29. Now, we're not going to fight every battle, the War of 1812. Okay, we're just not going to do it. But we're going to talk, and we're going to fight some of the battles. But we're going to talk more about the philosophies of the war than the actual military campaigns of the war. The War of 1812 was almost a comedy of errors. And there's certainly enough blame to go around for the sorry United States effort in the War of 1812. Just as we should not have won the American Revolution, we probably should not have won the War of 1812 either, but we won both of them, thank goodness. Some of the reasons for that terrible U.S. effort in the War of 1812. Well, I say that there are five main reasons. There were divisions within Madison's own cabinet. Many of the people some of the people were strong supporters of the war, and some of them were equally strong supporters of not going to war or ending the war as soon as possible. There were divisions within the Congress for the same reason. Even among Republicans, now, of course, one of the divisions was the few Federalists that were still serving in the Congress. I mean, and that's sort of obvious. You know that the Federalists are going to oppose it. But there was also opposition within Madison's own Republican Party as well. So there were some serious divisions within the Congress itself. Militarily, there was a lot of incompetence. There was a lot of incompetence among the officers of the United States Army. Many of these officers had never commanded any troops in war. There were some. The last time they had commanded troops, though, was in the American Revolution. They had been young junior officers. They had been lieutenants and captains back then. And what that means is that they were not in command of big units. And here it's 1812. It's 25 years later after the Treaty of Paris ends the American Revolution. And all of a sudden, these guys are wearing stars on their shoulders. And they've done nothing in the last 25 years to earn those stars, except they survived. They got older. They outlived other people. Number four, one of the problems, of course, was the hostility of the New England Federalists. As a matter of fact, the hostility of the New England Federalists bordered on treason. Now, quite often we throw that word around sort of loosely. Oh, that's treason. He ought to be taken out behind the barn and shot. Right? No, it's not. But the actions of the New England Federalists were treading dangerously close to real treason. And of course, the fifth reason why we had such a sorry war effort was Madison himself. He was the chief architect of the foreign policy that had resulted in the war to begin with. Now, our armed forces were not nearly prepared to go to war. Remember, at the risk of repeating myself, the Republicans, in the name of paying off the national debt and reducing taxes, they had gutted the military as they had reduced the size of the military in order to save money. Congress had gone along with that idea. Additionally, a year before the war begins, the Congress, at the urging of the Republicans, had killed the Bank of the United States. And so a legitimate question now arises, how are we going to pay for a war? War is one of the most expensive things that any nation can do. And we had no way to finance it because the Bank of the United States was dead. Even after the war was in progress, we had real trouble financing that war. Now, let's get back to the idea of the incompetence of the officers in the United States Army. Once again, at the risk of repeating myself, let me tell you that very few of the Revolutionary officers still in service were capable. I mean, they were old like me. They were fat like me, some of them had to have help getting up on the horse because they were so fat. That had to be a sight, huh? They were not ready physically. They were not ready mentally to wage war. Madison at least was honest enough to know that he was not capable of being a wartime leader, and so he depended on his Secretary of the Army and the Navy. The problem was that one of them, the Secretary of the Army, was incompetent, and the other was an alcoholic and was literally walked around in an alcoholic haze and didn't really even know what was going on around him. Now, Madison replaces the Secretary of the Army with a man by the name of John Armstrong. And things didn't get any better because Armstrong, the only thing Armstrong was concerned about was um, his own political advancement. Fortunately, Madison replaces the Secretary of the Navy also, and he replaces that old Secretary of the Navy with a man by the name of William Jones. And William Jones was competent. He was able to do the job in a Navy that was in relatively good condition, especially if you compare it to the Army. Why was the Navy in better shape than the Army? Well, the officers and the crews of this, and it's a little Navy, right? The United States Navy is a little, itsy bitsy teeny weeny Navy. But nevertheless, the officers and the crews of the ships that did exist had fought. They had combat experience. Remember the secret war against the French in the late 1790s? Well, many of the men uh, who were the senior non-commissioned officers and the senior officers of the U.S. Navy had fought in that war. So they knew what warfare was all about. Plus, they had fought against the pirates of North Africa. So, yes, they had much more military experience, much more current, much more contemporary experience than the Army officers did. And yet, there were still only 16 ships in the entire United States Navy. That's all she wrote. And once the British had blockaded the Atlantic coast, that little navy was bottled up, literally like a ship in a bottle, um, and had very little impact on what happened out in the oceans of the world. Now, Madison had few hopes that New England and the Federalists would ever support the war. And of course, he was right. They never did. That was sort of a given. But opposition at worst, or neutrality at best, existed in other areas as well. When word was received that the British had canceled uh, their their actions that had so angered the United States, some Republicans supported a wait and see attitude, expecting that the British would respond favorably to America's major concerns and the war would end before it really began. Plus, Madison, as was his nature, did not attempt to direct the debate in Congress. He let it play out on its own. Remember, he was a strict constructionist. The president was not supposed to get involved in the business of the Congress. Plus, he believed in permitting the lawmakers to make the decisions, and based on his reading, his interpretation, that narrow interpretation of the Congress. And with the Federalists opposing the war at every turn, on every issue, no matter how trivial, no matter how small, uh, debate breaks out in the Congress. And a lot of time is wasted over this trivial debate. Even the Now, let's play what if here. Okay, I say that even with strong presidential leadership, presidential leadership could not have overcome the problems that Madison was facing. But Madison's leadership was far from strong. Now, some of you are sitting there saying, boy, he sure is trashing James Madison. I mean, Madison's the father of the Constitution. Madison is the father of the Bill of Rights. And I say, yeah, you're right. Madison's strength was in political philosophy. Madison's strength was not in governance, right? The day-to-day running of a government. Madison was not really good at that. His leadership was far from strong. And as a result, harmony and consensus in the Congress and between the Congress and Madison never came close to reality. Madison pinned his hope for a quick, prompt, decisive war on Canada. He hoped that a Canadian campaign, an American invasion of Canada, might keep the British from attacking the United States. They would have their, remember, Canada belonged to England, and there were British soldiers who were permanently assigned to Canada. And all the Americans were just assuming that the first blow to be struck by the British would come out of Canada. That they would not remember what else was happening at the same time. The British were still fighting Napoleon. And many people assumed that the British didn't have the manpower to continue to fight and beat Napoleon and create a second front war against the Americans. And so many Americans assumed that the British soldiers that would fight us in the War of 1812 would be soldiers that invaded us from Canada. So what Madison planned was to strike the first blow. His plan was to invade Canada before England had a chance to invade us from Canada. He also saw the occupation of Canada as the logical extension of his belief that the English would only treat the United States fairly if they were beaten militarily. Madison was hopeful that military success in Canada would rally public opinion to him. Remember, there's all this division and strife, even within his own party. Um, Madison said, Madison was thinking that there was nothing that would be better than to have a nice military victory in Canada. Now, that campaign against Canada in the year of 1812 was an absolute disaster from the beginning. And I laugh because you've only got two choices here. You can laugh or you can cry. Madison's fears that the congressional support of the 25,000 man army was too ambitious proved to be true. When the war began, the U.S. Army numbered only about 6,700 ill equipped, ill fed, ill trained troops led by old men like me. It was a recipe for disaster. Recruiting ran behind schedule. Supply collection ran behind schedule. I mean, who was going to pay for all the uniforms and the food and the tents and all that stuff now that the Bank of the United States no longer existed? Very early in the war, a United States post up on the Canadian border near the city of Detroit. As a matter of fact, it was called Fort Detroit. There were 2,000 American soldiers stationed at Fort Detroit. They were surrounded by a smaller British force, and they surrendered to the British. 2,000 American soldiers surrendered without firing a shot. The surrender of Fort Detroit went a long way to explain what happens next. The proposed invasion of Canada from the United States is put off. It's canceled. It's no longer it's no longer on the drawing board. So the year of 1812 was a disaster for the Americans. No good came out of it. The year 1813 was somewhat better for the Americans, but not by much. By 1813, the British began to reinforce its troops in Canada. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe were winding down, and there seemed to be little chance that the United States Army, which was still weak and undermanned and ill-equipped and poorly led, could claim any victories beyond its own borders. And so it becomes the first goal of the British to reinforce Canada, so that if the United States does, in fact, invade, that attack can be beaten. However, there was good news. In late 1813, a young American sailor by the name of Oliver Perry cleared, using a small United States Navy force, cleared Lake Erie of British ships. That's where the famous saying, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," comes from. That's a quote from Perry on reporting back to Madison in Washington. "We have met the enemy and they are ours." So Perry and the United States Navy have a victory on Lake Erie. William Henry Harrison, who would later become a president of the United States, at that time he was a United States Army officer. Harrison defeated a British force on the Thames River. Now, that's like the Thames River in England. It's spelled Thames. It's spelled Thames. But, and that happened in Canada, by the way. That was just over the U.S. border in Canada. But that's really the only military victory that we enjoyed in the entire War of 1812 in Canada. The other goals of Madison, places like Quebec and Montreal and Toronto, they were never, ever really in danger of being attacked or conquered by the United States. The Royal Navy does what everybody is expecting the Royal Navy to do, and that is they blockade American Atlantic seaports from New York south. And they leave the New England ports alone. Now, why do you think that they would do that? Well, the British understood that there was division in America. The British understood that the Federalists were opposed, almost treasonously opposed, right, to the War of 1812. And so the British, at least early in the war, did their best to gain the support of the Americans who were members of the Federalist Party. And how better to do that than to blockade all of those ports from New York south, but to leave New England ports, especially Boston, right? To leave those open. Why? Because New England is where most of the Federalists lived. They hoped that by keeping New England trade open, the British hoped that by keeping New England trade open, that doing that would further intensify the disunion that seemed to be taking place in the United States. Now, once the U.S. failed to gain the early victories that Madison had hoped for, the odds of bringing the war to a successful conclusion declined very quickly. The French were on the decline in Europe, which means that the British, had they wanted to, could have sent a lot more troops to North America. With the defeat of the French, England can now use all of those resources, those military resources that had been dedicated to defeating Napoleon. They could now use those resources and dedicate those to defeating the Americans. Furthermore, the end of the European War threatened to nullify the whole reason for the conflict with England. Remember, the whole problem was neutrality rights, being able to trade with England and trade with France. Well, if France is defeated, France is out of the picture. And the whole reason why for the conflict that we're having with England is going to go away. If peace came to Europe, neutrality rights and impressments would become irrelevant. Madison could hardly continue to pursue the war based on an abstract theory protecting U.S. rights just for the full philosophical value of it. Now, let's introduce a new character into the story. We're going to partially introduce him. And the character, of course, is Andrew Jackson. Jackson was originally an Indian fighter, and he was a good one from all accounts. In August of 1813, the Creek Indians attack a fort in Alabama, and they kill half the men. Now, when they attack the fort, many of the settlers in the area run into the fort to what they hope is safety. But the Creeks attack the fort and kill half the people there. News of that massacre reached Andrew Jackson in Nashville, Tennessee, which is his home. He was not a member of the United States Army. He was a major general in the Tennessee militia. And yet he receives word in Nashville of the massacre, and he gathers up 2,000 volunteers, Tennessee volunteers. Have you ever wondered why the University of Tennessee athletic teams are called volunteers? Well, here it is. He gathers up about 2,000 Tennessee volunteers and sets out marching toward Alabama. Once he gets there, at a place called Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, the Creek Army faces the Tennessee militia in March of 1814. And the Tennesseans totally crush the Creek tribe. And as a result, the Creeks are forced by treaty to give about 2/3 of their ancestral lands to the United States of America. And that included huge pieces of the states of Georgia and most of Alabama that had all been Creek tribal lands, but no longer. Now, 4 days after that happens in March of 1814, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. 4 days later, after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Napoleon's empire collapses. And now the United States can divert its full attention to the defeat of the United States in the War of 1812. Now, the British plan, now I tell you, I'm not going to go into that. I only have a minute and a half left, and I'm certainly not going to be able to do much. So I am going to finish this lecture right now, and I will join you again soon talking about the British plan to win the War of 1812. And I will see you soon.